I thought the first rescue was just another unlucky tourist. I was wrong. I still remember watching that little GPS screen flicker and die in Martin Lake's hands. He was 3 hours into what should have been a simple day hike near Devil's Marbles, sweating under the territory sun like most tourists do when they first hit our country properly. The 32-year-old Englishman wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and stared at that blank screen like it might come back to life if he willed it hard enough. He'd started the morning full of confidence, the way they always do, decent equipment, or so he thought, a rough plan to see the marbles and get back to Alice Springs before dark. Standard tourist stuff that I'd coordinated rescues for maybe 50 times over the years. The wrong turn came at what he reckoned was a familiar junction. Looking back, Martin told me later he'd been following cattle pads instead of proper walking tracks for the better part of an hour. Easy mistake around Devil's Marbles. Endless stretches of spinifex grass, scattered ghost gums, and those granite boulders that all look the bloody same until you know the country properly. With his GPS dead, and the afternoon heat climbing toward 40 degrees, every direction might as well have been identical. By evening, Martin had accepted what a lot of tourists never want to face. He wasn't making it back to his rental car before dark. He'd rationed his water carefully enough, but 2 bottles don't last long when the land's trying to cook you. The desert cold hit him like a slap after the blazing day. He spent that first night huddled between 2 rocks, shivering and wondering if anyone would realize he was missing. His phone had lost signal hours ago. That emergency beacon he'd been advised to rent was back at his accommodation, another tourist oversight that seemed criminally stupid now that it mattered. The second day brought real desperation. Martin's lips cracked like old leather, his water was nearly gone. Every shadow looked like salvation, until he reached it and found only more empty bush. He'd been walking in what he hoped was a straight line toward where he thought the main road might be, but the terrain seemed to shift and fold back on itself. That's when panic really started setting in. Then he heard it, the distinctive WHUP of rotor blades echoing off the rocks. That's where I come in. I'm Dave McKenzie, been coordinating search and rescue for this region going on 15 years now. I found Martin mid-morning on his 3rd day out, waving frantically from a small clearing like his life depended on it. Which it probably did. I set the chopper down carefully between the larger rocks, and climbed out with water, and the kind of knowing look that every local gives tourists who've gotten themselves into proper trouble. You're about 15 kilometers southeast of where you should be, I told him, handing over a water bottle and watching him drink with the restraint of someone who'd learned the hard way. Lucky the station hand saw your car at the trailhead yesterday and called it in. I paused, studying his face. GPS failure? Martin nodded, still too dehydrated and embarrassed to trust his voice. I helped him into the helicopter with the efficiency that comes from doing this too many times before. Made my notes on the clipboard about rescue location and conditions. Standard procedure that I'd followed dozens of times. The flight back to Alice Springs gave Martin a bird's-eye view of just how badly he'd gone wrong. Humbling perspective on the vastness of country that can swallow a person without leaving so much as a footprint. First rule out here, I said over the headset as we flew, is never trust just one navigation system. I watched him nodding like he was taking it all in. And always tell someone your exact route and expected return time. I looked down at the endless red country stretching in every direction. The bush doesn't forgive mistakes. Martin spent 2 days recovering in Alice Springs. Rehydrating, nursing his sunburned skin back to something resembling normal. The hospital staff were professional, but clearly used to treating tourists who'd underestimated the outback. He told himself it was a learning experience, a story to tell back in Manchester, proof that he could survive in genuinely wild country. I figured that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, Martin was back, and that's when things started getting interesting. This time, he told himself, would be different. He'd upgraded his equipment, studied maps more carefully, planned a more conservative route through country he reckoned he was beginning to understand. The rental car agency had reluctantly agreed to rent him another 4-wheel drive, after he'd spun them a story about wanting to redeem himself with a proper outback experience. What he didn't mention to anyone was that he'd spent those 3 weeks in Alice Springs, talking to locals, asking questions, developing what he thought was a much better understanding of the area around Devil's Marbles. The local advice was unanimous: don't go alone, stick to marked tracks, and for God's sake, tell someone where you're going. Martin nodded and smiled and ignored every word. He'd studied the maps carefully now, understood the mistake he'd made the first time, reckoned he could handle a simple overnight camping trip to an area just north of his previous misadventure. The unmarked track looked obvious enough in daylight. Martin had spotted it on his drive out, a well-worn dirt road that headed off the main route toward what his map suggested might be old pastoral leases or mining claims. Exactly the kind of authentic outback experience that package tours never provided. He'd planned to camp somewhere along the track, explore a bit the next morning, be back in Alice Springs by afternoon with some genuine adventure stories and photographs. The rental car started making ominous noises just as the sun was setting. That particular coughing sound that means expensive trouble. Martin had driven further along the unmarked track than he'd originally intended, drawn by the promise of increasingly remote and spectacular country. When the engine finally gave up and died, he was at least 20 kilometers from the main road. Surrounded by low hills and scattered mulga scrub that looked nothing like the landmarks he'd memorized during his careful planning. Night fell with the suddenness that still surprises Southerners after months in the territory. His phone showed no signal. The emergency beacon he'd finally remembered to rent sat in his day pack, but he hadn't activated it. This was supposed to be a simple car breakdown, the kind of thing that happened to people all the time. Surely someone would come looking when he didn't return the rental car on time. Martin spent 4 increasingly desperate days walking in what he hoped was the right direction. His water ran out on the 3rd day. By the 4th he was seeing mirages and stumbling more than walking. The search helicopter found him on the 5th morning, collapsed in the shade of a desert oak about 30 kilometers from where he'd abandoned the rental car. I was leading the search team again. My expression was considerably less sympathetic this time around. Martin was severely dehydrated and badly sunburned, requiring immediate medical evacuation to Alice Springs Hospital. But even through his delirium, I could see him catching the sharp look I gave him when we loaded him into the helicopter. He heard the quiet conversation I had with the other rescue workers about the location where we'd found him. "Same bloody tourist from 3 weeks ago," I told the hospital staff as they wheeled Martin into emergency. "Found him about 40 kilometers south of where his car broke down." I shook my head, something nagging at me that I couldn't quite pin down. That's a hell of a detour for someone trying to walk back to the main road. During his recovery, Martin found himself under more scrutiny than he'd expected. I visited twice, asking detailed questions about his route planning and what had gone wrong with the rental car. The local police took a statement that felt more like an interrogation. Everyone was professional, but there was an undercurrent of suspicion that made Martin increasingly uncomfortable. What really caught my attention, though, was what the search team had found at Martin's rescue location. His water bottles were still nearly full when we found him, strange for someone who claimed to have been desperately dehydrated. His emergency supplies, including the rental beacon and a comprehensive first aid kit, were unused and still properly packed. Most puzzling of all, Martin had been found with detailed topographical maps that showed far more of the local area than any tourist would need. Marked with pencil notations that didn't correspond to any recognized hiking routes or camping areas. Funny thing, I mentioned casually during my second hospital visit, settling into the plastic chair beside his bed, "Is that you seem to know a fair bit about the country when we were flying you out?" I watched his face carefully. Asking about station boundaries, mining leases, that sort of thing. I leaned back, studying his reaction. Most tourists who've just been through an ordeal like that aren't too interested in local land tenure. Martin mumbled something about being naturally curious. His eyes didn't quite meet mine, but my skeptical look suggested the conversation wasn't over. When the hospital discharged him the next day, I was waiting in the lobby with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, apparently by coincidence. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something in Martin's expression that made me deeply uneasy. Over the following days, as Martin prepared for what everyone assumed would be his departure from Alice Springs, his behavior began raising red flags throughout the small rescue community. He visited the local mining registrar's office, asking detailed questions about historical claims and current lease boundaries. Spent hours at the Geological Survey office, studying maps and mineral surveys with an intensity that seemed odd for someone whose only experience with local country had involved getting dramatically lost. The questions he asked were specific and informed. Martin wanted to know about old gold workings, about which pastoral leases might have lapsed or changed hands. About areas that were technically accessible but rarely visited. He asked about water sources, vehicle access, which areas were genuinely off-limits, versus simply remote and difficult to reach. Station owners started mentioning encounters with the English tourist, who'd been asking about old mining sites on their properties. He'd been polite but persistent, particularly interested in areas that had seen historical gold mining but weren't currently worked. Several mentioned that he'd been spotted with what looked like surveying equipment, despite his claims to be just a tourist interested in local history. I started making my own inquiries. The rental car company confirmed that Martin had specifically requested vehicles suitable for remote track work. His accommodation revealed that he'd been receiving mail deliveries that included what looked like technical equipment and survey maps. Most tellingly, his credit card records showed purchases at mining supply stores in Alice Springs, hardly typical tourist expenses. When I pulled the records from both rescues, the pattern became even more suspicious. Martin's GPS hadn't simply failed during his first hiking adventure. The unit was found to be functioning perfectly when tested afterward. His wrong turn at Devil's Marbles had taken him toward an area known for historical gold finds but currently unworked, due to access difficulties and uncertain tenure. The second rescue location was even more interesting. Satellite imagery showed signs of old diggings and prospect holes in the immediate area, the kind of place that might attract someone with knowledge of local mining history. I began to suspect that Martin Lake wasn't just an unlucky tourist. The evidence suggested someone who was systematically exploring remote areas, using the guise of tourist misadventures to explain his presence in places where unauthorized mining activity would be both illegal and potentially profitable. The question was what Martin was really looking for, and whether his string of accidents was about to continue. The answer came sooner than I expected, in a way that would drag both of us much deeper into the remote country that Martin had been studying with such suspicious intensity. My suspicions crystallized into certainty when I confronted Martin during his recovery from the second rescue. What should have been a routine welfare check turned into something far more revealing. Martin was staying at the Desert Palms Motel, supposedly waiting for his travel insurance to process claims for his ordeal, but his room told a different story entirely. The bed was covered with detailed topographical maps, some of them hand-annotated with GPS coordinates and notes about geological features. A laptop displayed what looked like mining tenure databases and historical claim registrations. Most damning of all was the surveying equipment partially hidden in the wardrobe. Professional-grade GPS unit, soil sampling tools, and a metal detector that had clearly seen recent use. Bit of equipment for a tourist, I observed, standing in the doorway. I let my eyes sweep across the evidence scattered around the room. Martin's carefully maintained facade of grateful victim cracked slightly. I'm interested in geology. His voice carried just a trace of defensiveness. It's a hobby, right? I picked up one of the maps, noting the careful markings around areas that corresponded exactly to Martin's 2 rescue locations. And I suppose your hobby explains why you've been asking Bill Henderson about the old Sunrise Creek workings on his lease. The lie came smoothly, but I caught the calculation behind Martin's eyes. Local history fascinates me. He was already moving to pack away the maps, but I'd seen enough. I'm thinking of writing a book about Australian mining heritage. I studied one of the annotated maps more carefully. Funny how your research keeps getting you lost in places that happen to be productive gold country a century ago. Pure coincidence. But Martin's hands were shaking slightly as he folded the maps. I'd confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't tourism or academic interest. This was reconnaissance. Over the following days, I quietly reached out to my contacts across the region. The picture that emerged was of systematic exploration disguised as tourist mishaps. Martin had been visiting station properties under the guise of historical interest, but his questions were too specific, too focused on current tenure status and access routes. He'd been particularly interested in areas where old mining claims had lapsed, or where boundary disputes might create confusion about current ownership. The breakthrough came when Sarah Morrison from Willandra Station called me directly. Her voice was tight with concern. That English bloke who got himself lost, he was out here again yesterday. She paused, and I could hear wind through the phone line. Didn't come to the homestead this time, but Jimmy spotted his rental car parked near the old Copper Hill track. Another pause. When Jimmy went back this morning, the car was gone, but there were fresh tire marks heading into country that's been closed to public access since the native title determination. I felt my stomach tighten. The area Sarah was describing bordered on sacred sites that were strictly off-limits to unauthorized visitors. If Martin had pushed into that country, he wasn't just prospecting illegally, he was potentially committing serious cultural violations that could land him in federal court. Any idea how long ago he went in? I was already reaching for my keys, checking the fuel gauge on the ute. Jimmy reckons the tracks were maybe 6 hours old when he found them this morning. Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications. Could be 8 or 10 hours by now. I checked my watch. Late afternoon, with darkness coming in a few hours. If Martin was following his previous pattern, he'd have supplies cached and a planned extraction point, but the country Sarah was describing was genuinely dangerous. Remote, waterless and crisscrossed with old mine shafts that could swallow a man without trace. I'll need to get out there. Dave, that's Aboriginal land. Sarah's tone was firm. You'll need Billy Nakamara with you, and you'll need permission from the traditional owners. I knew Sarah was right. Billy Nakamara was the local Aboriginal ranger, responsible for monitoring activities on traditional country. If Martin had pushed into restricted areas, Billy would need to be involved from the beginning. More practically, Billy knew that country better than any European, and his tracking skills had saved lives before. The rental car was exactly where Sarah had described. Abandoned on a track that officially didn't exist on any public maps, but I could see immediately that this abandonment was different from Martin's previous emergencies. His belongings were gone, but selectively. Clothes and food were missing, but tourist items like cameras and guidebooks had been left behind. The car keys were hidden under the floor mat, rather than lost. Most tellingly, there was no distress beacon activation, no emergency call to authorities. Billy Nakamara arrived as I was examining the vehicle. The Aboriginal ranger was a compact man in his 50s, with traditional knowledge passed down through generations and modern training in land management. He studied the tire tracks and footprints around the car with the kind of methodical attention that I'd learned to respect absolutely. His weathered hands traced patterns in the dirt that told him stories I couldn't even see. This one's not lost, Billy said finally, straightening up and brushing dust from his palms. This one knows where he's going. That's what I figured. I looked at the tracks leading away from the car, trying to read the signs Billy was seeing. Question is whether we can figure out where that is before he gets himself into real trouble. Billy pointed to the tracks leading away from the car. His finger traced the direction with certainty. He's heading for the old Dreamtime Creek diggings. Billy's voice carried a weight that made me pay closer attention. That country's been restricted for good reasons, sacred sites, but also dangerous ground. He looked at me directly. Lot of old shafts out there, some of them going down 60-80 feet. We followed Martin's trail as the light faded, using Billy's intimate knowledge of the country to second-guess the route. It became clear that Martin had been studying this area carefully. His path avoided the most difficult terrain while staying roughly parallel to a dry creek bed that would lead him toward the historical mining sites. The footprints were confident, purposeful. He's been out here before, Billy observed, reading signs that I would have missed entirely. He knelt beside a section of disturbed ground, studying the impressions. These aren't the tracks of someone exploring. Billy stood, dusting off his hands. He knows this country. As we pushed deeper into the restricted area, we began finding evidence of Martin's true activities. A carefully concealed campsite with professional surveying equipment. Soil samples stored in labeled containers, organized with scientific precision. Most damning of all, fresh digging around old prospect holes that hadn't been disturbed for decades. The excavation work was systematic, methodical. This isn't just illegal prospecting, I realized, staring at the evidence scattered around the campsite. He's been systematically working old claims, probably caching whatever he found during his rescue operations. Billy's face was grim as he examined the disturbed ground around the old workings. His hands moved carefully over the evidence, reading details I couldn't see. Traditional owners have been watching this. Billy looked up at me, his expression serious. They knew someone was disturbing sacred country, But they wanted to catch whoever was doing it properly, not just chase them away. The significance of this hit me immediately. The local Aboriginal community had been conducting their own investigation, probably gathering evidence for prosecution under heritage protection laws. Martin's activities weren't just theft and trespass, they were cultural violations that carried serious federal penalties. We found Martin just after dawn. The circumstances were both vindication of my suspicions and a genuinely dangerous emergency. The Englishman was trapped in a partially collapsed mine shaft, conscious but unable to climb out without assistance. His voice echoed up from maybe 20 feet below ground, strained but coherent. Around him, scattered across the rocky ground, was evidence of a sophisticated operation. Gold samples in carefully labeled containers, professional assaying equipment worth thousands of dollars, detailed maps marking productive sites across the region. "Helps here, Martin." I called down into the shaft, testing the stability of the ground around the edge. "But we need to talk about what you've really been doing out here." Martin's voice echoed up from below, strained but defiant. "I'm injured." A pause, then more desperately. "You have to get me out first before asking questions." I rigged a rope system while Billy examined the equipment scattered around the shaft entrance. The Aboriginal ranger's expression grew increasingly serious as he catalogued what Martin had been doing. His methodical documentation of each piece of evidence would be crucial for the prosecution case. "This is systematic theft," Billy said quietly, holding up a notebook filled with GPS coordinates and geological notes. "He's been working our country for weeks, maybe months." Billy looked down into the shaft where Martin was waiting, using those rescue operations to explain why he keeps turning up in remote areas. When we finally hauled Martin out of the shaft, his condition was serious but not life-threatening. Dehydrated certainly, with some cuts and bruises from his fall. But nothing that suggested immediate medical emergency. What was more striking was his demeanor. Not the grateful relief of previous rescues, but the calculating wariness of someone whose elaborate deception had finally been exposed. The gold samples told the story. Martin had been systematically testing old workings across the region, identifying sites where historical mining had missed profitable deposits, or where modern techniques might extract value from old tailings. His tourist accidents had been cover for caching supplies and mapping access routes to sites that were either on restricted land or tied up in complex tenure disputes. "Clever system," I admitted grimly, securing the rope and checking Martin's injuries. "Play the helpless tourist, get rescued from remote areas, and nobody questions why you keep turning up where you shouldn't be." Martin remained silent, but his equipment spoke for itself. Professional assaying gear that must have cost him thousands. Detailed geological surveys that showed intimate knowledge of local mining history. Most damning of all, a notebook recording GPS coordinates for dozens of sites across the region, with notes about gold content and accessibility. As we prepared to transport Martin back to town, Billy made a discovery that elevated the situation from illegal prospecting to something much more serious. Hidden in Martin's pack was a collection of artifacts that had clearly been removed from protected sites. Stone tools worn smooth by countless generations of use. Ochre samples from sources that held cultural significance. Carved fragments that had obvious sacred meaning to anyone who understood their context. "This isn't just about gold," Billy said, his voice carrying a weight that made me look up sharply. He held up one of the stone tools, turning it carefully in his hands. "He's been looting sacred sites." Billy's eyes met mine, "taking things that can't be replaced." The full scope of Martin's operation was becoming clear. He hadn't just been stealing mineral resources. He'd been systematically pillaging Aboriginal heritage sites, probably for sale to private collectors who wouldn't ask questions about provenance. The rescue operations hadn't just been cover for prospecting. They'd been cover for cultural theft on a scale that could result in federal prosecution and international incident. As we loaded Martin into my vehicle for the journey back to Alice Springs, the Englishman finally spoke. His words revealed just how calculated his entire operation had been. "You people have no idea what's actually out here," he said, his voice carrying arrogance that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Sitting on resources worth millions, too worried about traditions and regulations to develop them properly." I caught Billy's eye in the rearview mirror and saw my own disgust reflected there. Martin wasn't just a thief. He was someone who fundamentally misunderstood what he'd been stealing, reducing both mineral wealth and cultural heritage to simple profit opportunities. The evidence scattered around the mineshaft would need to be carefully catalogued and secured. Martin's notebook contained enough information to prosecute him on multiple charges, but it also revealed the locations of other sites that would need to be checked for damage and secured against future intrusion. As we drove back toward town, I reflected on how completely Martin had manipulated the rescue system. Every call for help, every dramatic story of tourist misadventure, had been calculated deception, designed to exploit the good faith of people who risked their lives to help strangers in trouble. But Martin had made one crucial error in his elaborate scheme. He'd underestimated the people he was trying to deceive, particularly the traditional owners who'd been quietly watching and waiting for the right moment to expose his activities. His downfall hadn't come from his own mistakes. It had come from the patient, methodical investigation by people who understood their country far better than any outsider ever could. The drive back to Alice Springs stretched into the afternoon heat. Martin's silence had given way to a calculated arrogance that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. What started as defensive muttering evolved into something far more revealing, as Martin seemed to realize the full extent of what we'd discovered. "You think you've caught some bumbling tourist who got in over his head?" Martin said, shifting uncomfortably in his restraints. His voice carried a pride that made my skin crawl. "But you have no idea how sophisticated this operation really is." He leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. "Those rescue calls weren't mistakes or cover stories gone wrong. They were reconnaissance missions." Martin's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror. "Every time you people came to save me, I was mapping your response times, your resources, your blind spots." I caught Billy's expression in the rearview mirror. The same cold realization I felt myself. This hadn't been opportunistic theft escalating beyond Martin's control. It had been systematic exploitation from the very beginning. "The first rescue gave me 3 days to cache equipment at strategic locations," Martin continued. His voice carried the pride of someone explaining an elaborate chess game. "While you were focused on my dramatic survival story, I'd already marked GPS coordinates for 17 different sites." He paused, watching our reactions. "The second rescue let me establish supply drops and test how long I could operate before anyone noticed patterns." The scope of the deception was staggering. Every grateful handshake, every relieved smile from the rescue teams, every moment of genuine human concern for a lost tourist. All of it had been manipulated data points in Martin's larger scheme. "Those water bottles you found full during my second rescue?" Martin asked, clearly enjoying our reaction. "I had 3 different water caches within a kilometre radius." He shifted again, trying to find a more comfortable position. "The emergency supplies I didn't use?" "There were duplicate sets hidden at 4 different locations." His smile was predatory. "While your teams were congratulating themselves on saving the helpless Englishman, I was building the infrastructure for the most comprehensive resource extraction operation this region has ever seen." Billy leaned forward, his voice carefully controlled. "And the cultural sites, the artifacts, that was all planned too." Martin's expression shifted, revealing something uglier beneath his calculated pride. "Those were bonuses that became apparent once I started exploring." He looked directly at Billy, his contempt obvious. "Do you know what a pre-colonial stone axe goes for on the private collector market?" Martin's voice took on a lecturing tone. "What ochre samples from undocumented sites are worth to researchers who don't want to wait for official permits?" I felt sick. The Aboriginal heritage sites Martin had pillaged weren't just random discoveries during his prospecting activities. They'd been targeted specifically because his fake rescue operations had given him access to areas that legitimate researchers and collectors could never reach. "The beauty of the system was its scalability," Martin said, his voice growing more animated. "Each rescue gave me credibility for the next phase." He looked out at the passing landscape with proprietary satisfaction. The helpless tourist narrative meant nobody questioned why I kept returning to the same general area. Martin's eyes found mine again in the mirror. "And every time you people risked your lives to save me, you were actually helping me commit crimes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." The calculation was breathtaking in its cynicism. Martin had turned the rescue community's fundamental decency into the cornerstone of an international theft operation. Their willingness to risk everything for a stranger in trouble had become his most valuable resource. But as we approached the outskirts of Alice Springs, Martin's confident exposition took a more desperate turn. The reality of federal prosecution and international incident seemed to be settling in. His tone shifted from pride to negotiation. "Here's what you need to understand," he said, leaning forward as much as his restraints allowed. His voice took on the urgency of someone playing his last card. "That notebook you found contains GPS coordinates for 43 different sites." Martin's eyes darted between Billy and me. "Some are played out, but others represent mineral deposits that could be worth millions to legitimate mining operations." He paused for effect. "The cultural artifacts I collected, I know exactly where each piece came from, which sites have been compromised, which ones are still intact." I realized where this was headed and felt my stomach turn. "I could make all of that information disappear," Martin continued, his voice gaining confidence. "Or I could make it available to people who would use it responsibly." He looked directly at me through the mirror. "The mining claims could be properly developed through legal channels." His gaze shifted to Billy. "The damaged heritage sites could be reported for official restoration efforts." Martin leaned back slightly. "But if you proceed with prosecution, if you turn this into an international incident, that information gets scattered to the winds." It was extortion, pure and simple. Martin was threatening to destroy evidence that could help repair some of the damage he'd caused, unless we found a way to let him escape the consequences of his actions. "You're talking about dozens of sacred sites," Billy said, his voice carefully controlled but with an edge that could cut steel. "Places that have been protected for generations." Billy turned to look directly at Martin. "Sites that your activities have already damaged, maybe permanently." "Which is exactly why you need my cooperation to fix them," Martin replied smoothly. His confidence was returning as he warmed to his argument. "I'm the only one who knows the full extent of what's been disturbed and what's still intact." Martin's voice took on a reasonable tone. "Take me down, and that knowledge disappears forever." The manipulation was still continuing, even in custody. Martin was trying to use the very damage he'd caused as leverage to escape accountability for causing it. The scope of his operation hadn't just been about personal profit. It had been designed from the beginning to create exactly this kind of hostage situation. "Think about it practically," Martin pressed, his voice gaining urgency. "I disappear into the legal system, probably get extradited back to the UK eventually, and spend a few years in minimum security prison." He looked out the window at the passing country. "Meanwhile, 43 sites remain compromised, mining claims stay in legal limbo, and nothing gets restored." His eyes met mine again. "Or, we find a way to work together, and I provide everything needed to actually repair the damage." I found myself thinking about all the rescue volunteers who'd risked their lives responding to Martin's fake emergencies. The helicopter pilots who'd flown dangerous missions through dust storms and thermal turbulence. The ground teams who'd searched through brutal conditions, dehydrated themselves while looking for someone who wasn't actually lost. The coordinators who'd worked around the clock, pulling resources from other emergencies, all of them manipulated into facilitating cultural theft and environmental destruction. But Martin had made one crucial miscalculation in his desperate bargaining attempt. He was assuming that the people he'd deceived would be willing to compromise with him to minimize the damage he'd caused. What he didn't understand was that Billy represented a community that had been dealing with similar exploitation attempts for generations. They had their own methods for dealing with people who stole from country. "You're right that this is bigger than just arresting one tourist," Billy said finally, pulling out his phone. His voice was calm, but I caught the satisfaction underneath. "But you're wrong about needing your cooperation to fix it." He made a call, speaking in language I didn't understand but could recognize as official and serious. The conversation was brief but detailed, with Billy providing what sounded like coordinates and status updates. When he finished, Billy turned back to Martin with something that might have been satisfaction. "Traditional owners have been documenting your activities for weeks," Billy explained, his voice taking on an educational tone. "Every site you visited, every disturbance you caused, every artifact you removed." Billy looked directly at Martin. "We know exactly what you took and where you took it from." He smiled slightly. "The elders were waiting to see the full scope of your operation before acting, but they were never dependent on your cooperation to understand it." Martin's confident expression cracked for the first time since we'd found him at the mineshaft. The color drained from his face as he realized his leverage was evaporating. The foundation of his bargaining position was built on assumptions that were completely wrong. "The GPS coordinates in your notebook?" Billy continued, clearly enjoying Martin's reaction. "Most of those sites are already under traditional protection protocols." Billy looked out at the passing landscape with proprietary knowledge. "The mining claims you thought you were exploiting. Half of them were never actually valid, and the other half are tied up in native title disputes that have been ongoing for years." His voice carried quiet authority. "You were stealing from places that were never available for legitimate development anyway." The final pieces of Martin's scheme were falling apart. His sophisticated operation had been built on fundamental misunderstandings about land rights, cultural protocols, and resource management in the region. He'd committed serious crimes to access opportunities that largely didn't exist. "What about the artifacts?" Martin asked, his desperation now obvious in his voice. "Those are irreplaceable." He looked frantically between Billy and me. "You still need my information to return them properly." "The artifacts will go back where they belong," Billy said, his voice carrying the finality of someone speaking from absolute authority. "But that process doesn't require your participation." Billy looked directly at Martin. "Traditional owners know their own country." His voice was patient but firm. "They know their own cultural materials." Billy's expression was almost pitying. "They don't need a tourist to tell them what's sacred, or where it belongs." I realized that Martin's entire operation had been based on a colonialist assumption that local people wouldn't understand the value of their own resources, or be capable of protecting them effectively. His elaborate deception had been designed to exploit not just legal and regulatory gaps, but cultural misunderstandings that existed primarily in his own mind. The drive continued in silence, as Martin seemed to process the collapse of his bargaining position. His confident arrogance had given way to something approaching panic. I found myself thinking about how the rescue community would need to adapt their procedures to prevent similar exploitation. But I also realized that the traditional owners' patient, methodical approach had been far more effective than any emergency response protocol could have been. As we reached the police station in Alice Springs, I felt the weight of what we'd uncovered. Martin would face federal charges for the theft, trespass violations for accessing restricted land, fraud charges for his systematic deception of rescue services, international prosecution for trafficking in cultural artifacts. But beyond the legal consequences, his actions had violated something more fundamental about trust and community responsibility. The rescue system worked because people were willing to risk their lives for strangers. That willingness was based on shared understanding that anyone could find themselves in genuine trouble, that helping others in crisis was both a practical necessity and a moral obligation. Martin had perverted that system, turning altruism into exploitation and community trust into criminal opportunity. But as we transferred Martin to police custody and began the process of cataloging evidence, I realized that the traditional owners' response had demonstrated something important about resilience and protection that went far beyond any individual case of theft or fraud. They had been watching, documenting and waiting, not out of passivity, but out of systematic understanding about how to respond effectively to exactly these kinds of violations. Martin's operation had been sophisticated, but it had also been fundamentally ignorant about the community he was attempting to exploit. His downfall hadn't come from his own mistakes, or from law enforcement investigation. It had come from underestimating the knowledge, patience, and protective capacity of people whose connection to the country ran far deeper than any GPS coordinate or mineral survey could measure. 3 months after Martin Lake's arrest, I found myself back at my desk in the Rescue Coordination Center, sorting through routine reports and weather updates like any other Tuesday morning. The paperwork for the Lake case had finally been completed. Federal prosecutors had moved quickly once they understood the scope of the operation. Martin was facing a substantial prison sentence along with deportation back to the UK. The stolen artifacts had been returned to the appropriate traditional owner groups through a ceremony I'd been honored to attend. The illegal mining equipment had been seized as evidence, but the case had left its mark on me in ways I was still discovering. When the satellite phone rang that Tuesday morning, with a distress call from a German backpacker who'd gotten separated from his group near Stanley Chasm, I felt a familiar flutter of wariness that hadn't been there before Martin Lake. I found myself asking more pointed questions during the initial contact. How exactly had the separation occurred? What supplies did the caller have? Had they attempted this route before? The responses sounded genuine enough, but I realized I was listening with different ears now. My questions were more specific, more probing. I was paying attention to details that would have seemed irrelevant before Martin's elaborate deception. The rescue itself proceeded smoothly. The German tourist Hans was exactly where he said he'd be, genuinely distressed and grateful for help, carrying only the basic hiking supplies he'd mentioned during his call. But as I coordinated the helicopter pickup, I caught myself noting details that would have seemed paranoid before: the specific brand of GPS unit Hans was carrying, whether his hiking boots showed wear patterns consistent with the terrain where he'd supposedly been walking, how his water consumption matched the timeline he'd described. It felt wrong to approach every rescue with suspicion, but I couldn't shake the knowledge that the system's openness made it vulnerable. The rescue community operated on the assumption that distress calls were legitimate, that people calling for help were genuinely in trouble, that the urgency of potential life or death situations justified immediate response, without extensive verification. Martin Lake had exploited exactly that assumption, turning the community's willingness to act quickly on trust into an opportunity for systematic deception. During the debrief after Hans's successful rescue, I found myself discussing procedural changes with my team. Should we require more detailed verification of caller identity? Should there be flags in the system for repeat customers, especially international tourists who seem to get into trouble multiple times? Should we coordinate more closely with local Aboriginal ranger groups who might notice patterns that emergency responders missed? But every potential safeguard came with costs that felt wrong. Requiring extensive verification would delay responses to genuine emergencies. Flagging repeat rescues could stigmatize people who legitimately needed help more than once. The outback was genuinely dangerous, and some people were simply unlucky or inexperienced. Most troubling, increased bureaucracy would shift the culture of rescue work from immediate humanitarian response toward law enforcement, changing the fundamental nature of what made the system effective. A week later, I had lunch with Billy Nakamura to discuss how traditional owner groups might be incorporated into rescue coordination protocols. Billy's patient approach during the lake investigation had been crucial, but it had also revealed gaps in communication between emergency services and local communities, who had extensive knowledge of who was moving through their country. Problem is, Billy explained over coffee, stirring sugar with thoughtful precision, we see lots of things that might be relevant to your work, but we don't always know what's worth reporting. He paused, considering his words carefully. Someone camping in an unusual location, someone asking weird questions about land use, someone who comes back to the same area multiple times. Billy looked up from his coffee. Could be innocent, could be something else. He shrugged slightly. Before the lake business, we might have just kept an eye on it ourselves. I understood the challenge. Traditional owners had their own protocols for dealing with people who didn't belong, or who were behaving inappropriately on country. Those protocols were often more effective than official law enforcement. But they operated on different timescales and different assumptions about authority and jurisdiction. The rescue system needed to find ways to benefit from that knowledge without co-opting it, or turning traditional owners into unpaid surveillance workers for government agencies. We worked out a loose arrangement, where ranger groups would have direct contact numbers for the Rescue Coordination Center, where rescue coordinators would check in with local traditional owners when we noticed patterns that seemed unusual. It wasn't a formal protocol. Both Billy and I were wary of creating bureaucratic structures that would inhibit either emergency response or traditional management practices. But it was a recognition that isolation between different groups responsible for safety and land management had created opportunities for exploitation. The arrangement proved valuable sooner than either of us expected. 2 weeks after our lunch, Billy called me to report that his cousin had seen the same rental car in 3 different remote locations over the past month. Always with a single occupant, who seemed to be taking photographs and making notes. No distress calls had come from that area, but the pattern reminded Billy of Martin Lake's early reconnaissance trips. I ran the rental car plates and found they were registered to a Canadian graduate student named Rebecca Chen. She was supposedly researching historical mining sites for her dissertation. Her visa and university credentials checked out, but when I called her listed phone number, the conversation felt uncomfortably familiar. Rebecca was knowledgeable about local geography, asked thoughtful questions about emergency procedures. mentioned casually that she'd heard about the Martin Lake case and was taking extra precautions to avoid similar problems. Instead of waiting for Rebecca to get into trouble, I decided to be proactive. I contacted the university where she was supposedly enrolled and discovered that while Rebecca Chen was indeed a registered graduate student, her research proposal had been rejected by the ethics committee. It involved accessing restricted sites without proper permits. The university had no record of her traveling to Australia. Her supervising professor hadn't heard from her in months. I coordinated with Billy to locate Rebecca before she could get lost and require rescue. We found her camped near a water bore, surrounded by geological survey equipment and maps that marked several locations where Martin Lake had been active. When confronted, Rebecca initially maintained that she was conducting legitimate research, but the evidence was overwhelming. She'd been in contact with Martin Lake before his arrest, had decided to continue his work after studying reports of his methods in mining industry forums. Unlike Martin, Rebecca hadn't yet committed any major crimes. She was still in the reconnaissance phase of her operation, but the attempted fraud was clear enough to warrant deportation and academic sanctions. More importantly, her quick apprehension demonstrated that the informal coordination between rescue services and traditional owners could prevent exploitation before it escalated into crisis. The Rebecca Chen incident made me realize that the Martin Lake case probably wasn't unique. Online forums and social media made it easy for information about successful scams to circulate among people with similar intentions. The rescue system's vulnerabilities were now documented and discussable in ways that made them more likely to be exploited by copycats. But the improved coordination with local communities also meant that exploitation attempts were more likely to be detected early. Traditional owners had always been aware of unusual activity on their country, but they now had direct channels to share that information with people who could act on it quickly. The rescue system was becoming more sophisticated without becoming more bureaucratic. 6 months after the Lake arrest, I felt like I'd found a sustainable balance. I still approached new rescue calls with more analytical attention than before, but I'd learnt to distinguish between appropriate caution and counterproductive suspicion. Most calls were genuine. Most people in distress were exactly what they appeared to be. Most rescues proceeded without complications that suggested ulterior motives. The difference was that I now understood the rescue system as part of a larger network of people responsible for safety and protection in remote areas. Emergency responders, traditional owners, station managers, tourism operators, and regular community members all had pieces of information that could identify patterns of exploitation or abuse. Connecting those pieces didn't require formal bureaucracy, but it did require ongoing relationships and communication that went beyond crisis response. When the phone rang with the next distress call, a family of 4 whose car had broken down on the Tanami track, I found myself responding with renewed confidence. My questions were more thorough than they would have been before Martin Lake, but they were also more focused. I was listening for specific inconsistencies rather than general suspicion, coordinating with local knowledge sources as a matter of routine rather than as a special precaution. The family rescue went smoothly. Their gratitude reminded me why the work mattered. The father mentioned that they'd been nervous about traveling in such remote country, but had been reassured by knowing that help would be available if something went wrong. That trust, between strangers, between communities, between people who would never meet but who shared responsibility for each other's safety, was exactly what Martin Lake had tried to exploit. But it was also what had made Lake's downfall inevitable. The same networks of trust and mutual responsibility that he'd attempted to manipulate had ultimately exposed and stopped him. The rescue system worked because it was embedded in communities of people who looked after each other and their country. Exploiting it required violating not just specific regulations, but the fundamental social relationships that made remote area safety possible. As I updated my incident reports and prepared for the next call, I realized that the Martin Lake case had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened my faith in emergency response systems, not because those systems were invulnerable to exploitation, but because they were resilient in ways that went far beyond any individual protocol or procedure. They were backed by communities of people who understood that genuine cooperation and mutual aid were more powerful than any individual attempt at manipulation or fraud. The phone would ring again, and there would be genuine emergencies and false alarms, routine rescues and complex investigations. But I now understood my work as part of something larger and more robust than I'd previously realized. A network of people committed to each other's safety and well-being, that was flexible enough to adapt to new threats, while maintaining its essential character of immediate response to human need. If you've ever driven the long roads through Red Country, you know how small we all are out there, how much we depend on each other when things go wrong. Hit like and subscribe. More stories from the territory are coming.